Most welcome to this EBA seminar, which is called Listening to Locals in Peacebuilding, Experiences from Bosnia, Myanmar, and International Peacebuilding Partnerships. And the webinar is arranged by EBA, which is the acronym for the Expert Group for Aid Studies. We are to discuss a highly intriguing and much discussed issue, both in academia and in policy circles, and that has to do with the connection between peace building and local perceptions and ideas and works in peace. We will listen to presentations that circle around 3 different dissertations, and the texts that are to be discussed are called Dissertation Development Briefs. Dissertations. My name is Helena Lindholm and I am the chair of EBA and I will moderate this session. And before we start our endeavors today, we will just watch a brief film about EBA.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
So that was a small introduction about EBA. Apologies if anyone was not familiar in Swedish. Anyway, there are lots of exciting and interesting reports to be found at the EBA's webpage. But today we will listen to 3 researchers who recently have defended their doctoral dissertations. And all are on fascinating themes, and they will present their DDBs for 15 minutes each, including questions for clarification from you, from the audience. Then we will have a session with comments and questions, after which there is a possibility for Q's and A's, discussions and comments. First, we will listen to Sanela Bajramovic, who will present her brief, which deals with the Swedish organization Kvinna till Kvinna, Woman to Woman, and their work related to women's peace building in Bosnia between 1993 and 2013, so a pretty extensive time period, and with a particular focus on the hierarchies involved in this cooperation. The second presentation will be held by Pernilla Johansson, who will present her research about what she calls listening practices and the role of emotions in international peace-building partnerships, an area which is seldom focused upon, I would say. And our third presentation will be held by Thomas Cole, who will present his text, which focuses on struggles to transform particular areas, a particular war-torn area in Myanmar, into a protected area controlled by indigenous populations, and linking the concept of peace with conservation and protection. After those presentations, we will hear from Johanna Malm, who is project manager at the FBA, Folke Bernadotte-akademin, and their work with the Swedish Development of Cooperation Strategy for the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she holds a PhD herself in international development study from Roskilde University, and she will comment on the briefs. So after her comments and the discussion between Joanna and the panelists, we will have an open discussion with the opportunity for all of you to pose questions. And the best way to ask questions is to simply write them in the Q&A function, and then I will be able to see them. Also, I'd like to say that feel free to use our tags if you want to post anything on social media about the seminar. But without further ado, I would like then to give the word to Sanela Bayramovic, who defended her thesis, which is called Hierarchical Sisterhood, Supporting Women's Peace Building Through Swedish Aid to Bosnia and Herzegovina during the time period 1993 to 2013. And she presented her thesis, or defended her thesis, at the School of Humanities, Education and Social Sciences at Örebro University in October 2018. So please, Sanela, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Helena. And I would like to start by thanking EBA for inviting us to speak on and together really ponder international local relationships and the importance of listening in peace-building practices. And I'm sincerely glad that both research and practice slowly but surely realizes that this is a hugely important topic. I myself have no experience regarding working with peace building as a practitioner, so I cannot speak from that position. However, spending years studying those who have extensive experience of working with supporting peace in conflict-affected areas, I can firmly conclude that it is a difficult task, actually extremely difficult task. It is a thorny path with many challenges, and despite good intentions, there is still a risk of doing harm. With that being said, I'm by no means implying that we should retreat and be bystanders to war, conflict, and inequality. Actually, the actors that I've studied, both international and local, taught me that staying at home cannot be an alternative. Next slide, please. Now, in the midst of the Bosnian War, those active within the already extensive and competent relief work going on at the grassroots level. So in these troubled times, it was clearly important to show solidarity with the women in the war zone, for whom quite simple gestures, such as receiving a women's package with necessities, somebody asking really about one's well-being and needs, it was of great symbolic significance. And I have a quote on this slide, actually from one of the women that wrote to Kvinna till Kvinna in 95, I believe, one of the women in Tuzla who received a women's package. And she said, "You give us hope to believe in the existence of humane and objective people who understand the suffering and this war better than politicians who represent us as uncivilized and illiterate tribe members. We are degraded people. All gestures like this one delight us and bring back the belief that somebody understands and respects us." And from my ongoing research, I can reveal that these gestures of solidarity still evoke emotionally strong memories. Now, as in the 90s, we learned that women saw them as something that for a moment kind of restored their dignity and reminded them of normalcy or the life before the war. So it's really important that we do something. However, we need to continuously ponder what we do and how we do it. Next slide, please. Now, although these early actions were indeed interesting and thought-provoking, in my dissertation, I was curious to study what happens when international organizations such as Kvinna till Kvinna enter a conflict-affected area and their role on the ground. So even if I, in one of the chapters, really talk about the work for Bosnia in Sweden, in the rest of the thesis, I write about the work on the ground. What kind of support do these organizations provide? What kind of relationships are possible to establish with the local? And what factors condition the relationships built? The overall aim was to contextualize and analyze the possibilities and challenges faced by Kvinna till Kvinna during 2 decades of supporting Bosnian women's organizations. And if you look at my research questions, they are about the role Kvinna till Kvinna played, about the relationship that was unfolded over time. And of course, it is about a very important background actor, Sida, and Kvinna till Kvinna's relationship with Sida and how it affected the relationship with the local. So really 2 main actors and 1 very important background actors that I deal in the thesis with. And this is a study that studies this engagement over time, 20-year period, and with a clear ambition actually to do, to study this relationship from both main actors' perspectives. And I focus on a specific context, Bosnia, and with strong international presence. Now, our time today is limited, so everything that has to do with materials used, methods, theory, and the very important context that I kind of stress all the time in my thesis, you will need to read about that in this report that I have written or in the dissertation itself. So, next slide, please. Yes, a growing number of studies shows that women in conflict-ridden societies play a decisive role in resolving conflicts and normalizing human relations in their communities. But despite these achievements on the ground and several UN resolutions, women's peace efforts remain unrecognized, undervalued, and actually also under-researched. And I think what I kind of contribute with this thesis is that I document and I analyze quite successful domestic and international women's engagement for peace, now within the context of peace building in Bosnia, which I'm really proud of, that I have been able to contribute with this knowledge about what women actually do in terms of peace building, given that they mostly operate at a grassroots level and informal efforts and so on. And for doing this, they really need to have a huge amount of creativity, courage, and persistence. And this really applies to both international and local actors. Now, a few words about the findings. So the next slide, please. Yes, I found 2 parallel lines of thought in this thesis. The first one is female solidarity, which cannot be questioned, definitely cannot be questioned. It was manifested through genuine care about the well-being of Bosnian activists, long-term presence in Bosnia, dialogue with Bosnian partners, and ambition really to take local initiatives seriously. And I can conclude that fruitful cooperation, Kvinna till Kvinna has been able to create fruitful cooperation with local NGOs, really supporting them to meet, to create meeting places for them in a segregated context, and really encourage them to do things together, joint action. Next slide, please. Now, parallel to this, I have also observed that Kvinna till Kvinna's mission in Bosnia, as actually they usually are nowadays, has been pedagogical. There is a clear striving to influence the Bosnian counterparts, their thinking and their actions, of course, by using soft methods. The right knowledge, I also found that the right knowledge about gender equality, the third sector, and even feminism was to be found in Sweden. And I also observed a bit of lack of knowledge about, and even sometimes interest in, the historical context of the post-Yugoslav area, which all the research actually about peace building stresses that this is really important. This contextual knowledge is really important. And I have interpreted this as notions of Swedish supremacy. Why I call it Swedish and not Western is that these kind of thoughts really appeared also in relation to other donors in the area. I think we can go to the next slide. Yes, so of course, what affected this encounter, mötet? It was affected and conditioned by several factors. One of them is, of course, that Yugoslavia was an unexplored area for Swedish aid. It was the first time, actually, that Sweden went into the area as a donor. Sida was a very important actor that affected the relation between Kvinna till Kvinna and its Bosnian partners in many ways. And Bosnia, as a post-conflict or conflict area, was a real challenge and is a real challenge for international peace builders still. I can also conclude that this relationship was asymmetrical, as they actually usually are within this context. But I could also see, because I studied this over time, I was able to see that there was some mobility with regards to, superior, inferior positions. There were subtle forms of resistance that came from Bosnian NGOs, and that who was in a superior, inferior position really depended on situation that they were in. And at last, I'm also kind of questioning idealized images of the local as peace-loving forces for change and powerless victims of Western domination, because I found that many times finding really local actors who were willing to work for peace, as Kvinna till Kvinna saw it, of course, wasn't always easy. Next slide. Okay, I will finish by speaking about a few implications and recommendations. How are we doing with the time, Helena?
Sorry, you have a couple of more minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I think I have three pictures, three slides to go through. Now, my overall findings suggest that actually a mixture of Kvinna till Kvinna's own notions of women's peace building and of the area in which it operated, along with donor agendas and concrete situation on the ground, actually both enabled and limited its work in Bosnia. What we can conclude is that international peace builders with sincere commitment to support local peace efforts, which I believe and show that Kvinna till Kvinna has been, they enjoy credibility among local actors and can create fruitful long-term cooperation with them. Experiences and knowledge that internationals possess affect their approach to actors and initiatives they encounter on the ground. What Kvinna till Kvinna really had was this broad view on peace and peace building. They were interested in women, they were interested in grassroots, they were interested in really informal peace work. So what definitions of peace and peace building we use matters, and this applies both to researchers as well as practitioners. And I have written that, especially regarding major donors, it is really important that major donors, such as donor agencies, for example, that they have comprehensive and nuanced knowledge about peace processes and the will to use it. For Kvinna to Kvinna also, they came from the peace movement. They had the experience of transnational encounters with women, and they really approached the area with an open attitude, curiosity, and genuine care. This is enormously important. Actually, in the beginning, it is even more important than having knowledge about the context.
We're approaching the time limit soon. Yeah.
Okay, next slide. And it's really important for donor agencies, for example, to avoid burdening these parties with excessive bureaucracy, because it tends to affect the relationships they have worked hard to establish. One really disturbing conclusion has been that the power imbalance increased over time as Kvinna to Kvinna grew and became more professionalized. And shared core values are really important, combined with dialogue-based approach. But an emphasis on female solidarity, local ownership, and dialogue doesn't necessarily solve the problem of power imbalance between these actors. So you have always to be alert regarding the risks of power asymmetry, and need to reflect on the consequences of our own thinking and actions. And the last slide. Yes, I think also that it's important for both practitioners and donor agencies to really have a critical reflection on the extent to which authentic local initiatives are encouraged. And it's really important to develop deeper interest in contextual knowledge. There needs to be a will to understand the points of others, and as well as a critical approach to one's own references. And I talk about this in terms of rhetorical listening. So it's going to be really exciting now to listen to Pernilla, who will talk about listening in this context. At last, it's equally important now that we start problematizing our rather uncritical stance towards the local, as well as the essentialist understanding of the international local relationship, where we think that the international always have power and the locals are always associated with resistance. Thank you.
And how do internationals listen to the locals? Yes, so please, Pernilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helena. So I'm waiting for my first slide to come on, but I must say that it was a perfect planning to put this in this order, I think. It was great to have Sanela's dissertation as a background example for a more general problematic that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so there we go. The invisibility cloak, how internationals' emotions affect their listening in peace-building partnerships. I'm so happy to hear these co-presenters and see so many interested people when the listening of internationals is on the agenda. As Helena said, it's not that often. We hear much more problematizing about the local and the relationship in itself, and not so much focus on the internationals. So I'll give you a teaser today, and you can read more in the brief or in the book that comes on Routledge in the fall. I'll tell you a little about my findings, a tiny bit of theory, give a few examples, and then end with recommendations that might be for all of us, practitioners, policymakers, and researchers alike, if we want to change partnerships. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about me and the doubts that led me to do this research, because I'm guessing I share them with many of you, or you wouldn't be here. Next slide, please. So I was inspired by a series of earlier jobs at Kvinna till Kvinna, a fantastic organization we've already heard about, but I want to be really clear that I did the research separately as an individual. And of course, it's also separate from my coming job as head of Sida Partnership Forum starting next week. But have a look at this picture. It's from Kosovo in 2006. Here I am in the office of a local peace-building partner organization, very intently listening to them. And man, it was hard work, not just because I had to eat all those snacks that you can glimpse in the left-hand corner, but I was often exhausted from trying to understand them within the contract that we had, to understand what the best activities that we were funding were, because we had the money, what capacity building they would need, because we had the know-how or the contacts, and how this would affect peace building, because they were in the conflict affected area, not us. So when I moved to the head office later, listening to partners got harder because it got more abstract, so far away from these concrete meetings even. Was it just me that had trouble with listening in these partnerships? When many years later I started this research, I found that the answer was no, apparently not. For example, listen to this quote from a discussion in an INGO when they had been evaluated by local partners. Next slide, please. Most painful was to hear that we don't ask local partners advice because we think we do it all the time, and we base everything we do on what they tell us. So this quote expresses a central peace-building norm that internationals should listen to locals, and how difficult it is to implement because local actors rarely feel heard. But okay, norm for whom? So practitioners like this one, and like Sanela described, strive for equal partnerships and want to listen to their partners. They even think they do it all the time. There's also policy documents that have all thrown out the donor and recipient terminology and replaced it with local ownership and equal partnership. That means internationals must listen to local partners. And even researchers agree, and you know how rare that is. But for the last 20 years now, they've documented problems with internationals trying to import solutions or bring ready-made peace from IKEA. In other words, there is a normative consensus. Internationals must listen better to local actors. So what's the problem? Well, research also shows, no, go back, giving it away. Thank you. Research shows that just as in this evaluation of one partnership, in general, local actors do not feel heard by their international partners. So that gives us the puzzle. Now, next slide, please. Why are internationals so bad at listening to locals, even when they want to and know they should? A few notes on my research and how I went about it to investigate this puzzle. First, I interview internationals, not locals, because the listening is the problem. So I thought some part of the answer should be or could be with internationals. Second, defining listening, I don't mean waiting to speak, but receptive listening. So I'm not sure if that's similar to Sanela's rhetorical listening, but I use receptive, meaning you are open to learn and change based on what you hear. It sounds simple, but again, research shows it's quite rare. And third, as I said, everyone agrees in theory, so I investigate everyday practices. That means I ask them about their everyday tasks and ordinary days, because practices are things you do because that's how things are done here. It's unspoken know-how of how to play a social game, you could say. You have a feel for what the rules are. And if you think about it, I think we've all seen that new person, maybe from another sector coming in, and you can tell they don't have the feel for how we do things here, at least not yet. So I wanted to see if there's anything about how we do things that hinders internationals from listening receptively. And remember that the quote started, most painful. So as I describe in the brief, the stories about practices, very unexpectedly to me, were packed with emotions. So I had to dive deeper into the role of emotions in listening and change. Next slide, please. So here, I just want to give you an overview, a taste of the emotions to the left that turned up as connected to the practices to the right. So there was stress and tension connected to juggling contradictions. There was anxiety in avoiding taboos. There was pride in facilitating local dialogues. And there were also yes moments of achievement when translating between partners and donors. And there was a feeling of responsibility to link partners with donors. So this discovery or realization from me meant I had to go to other disciplines than peace and conflict studies, or even than practice studies, to get tools to analyze how these emotions could be relevant to receptive listening and change. Next slide, please. So I used findings from neuroscience and intersectional feminist political theory that together give a model of emotions as relational and orienting. So very briefly, relational means that emotions are saying something about the relationship between us who are feeling something and the object we feel something about. The object can be a person, a thing, a practice, anything. Emotions don't live inside us and come out, and they don't live outside us and come in. But they're part of the relation between us and the object. They hold information about us, our context, and our history. So an easy example is the police are more likely to feel suspicious of a Black person than of me. And that suspicion doesn't appear in the moment. It's connected to centuries of material racism. And it says something about me, that I have a privilege in this context. Emotions also orient our attention. And I tried to understand how the emotions you saw in the last slide oriented internationals' attention toward or away from what. So simply put, all of the emotions we saw orient internationals' attention towards their partners, just like you saw me in the first picture. So that should be good for listening. But at a closer look at the relational aspect, the orientation is so extreme that the overall effect is, next slide, please. Ta-da! The invisibility cloak. While it's good to pay attention to your partner, if you're not really there, it's very difficult to work together and to change the relationship. A historical perspective shows that the privileged party being invisible, this asymmetry, reproduces the power hierarchies that peacebuilding is built from. So even though the ideal of practitioners is to change the relationship, every day they make daily emotional micro investments, you could say, in keeping things the way they are. And why is that? Well, the pull of the invisible cloak is that it's quite comfy. I mean, imagine wearing one, being like Harry Potter. You can blend into the background and avoid attention. You're free to move around and make your moves as the spotlight is on someone else. You don't have to account for every step that you take to Severus Snape or Dumbledore. And in fact, internationals, as we said before, are rarely on the partnership agenda even. But as I show in the brief, basically everything locals do as persons, as organizations, even geopolitically, can end up on the partnership agenda. So that's why it's refreshing that we're talking about internationals today. But it's easy to understand then the temptation to slip on or stay under this privileged outfit. It's comfortable to fit in, playing the game. But here's the catch. If we want equal partnerships, we want to change the game, don't we? So then we have to fail to fit in, break shared orientations, take risks. And that's not comfortable at all, but the opposite. So listen to this quote from an interviewee who tried an equal contract, so different from the ones I was working with, an equal contract with their partners. Next slide, please.
Pernilla, a couple of more minutes to go.
Thanks. It's not clear from the outset who should decide. That was uncomfortable at times. Now you can read more in the brief about the risks they took and about other counterexamples where interviewees had pushed for change and felt uncomfortable, vulnerable, and uncertain. And in fact, this is the key to change. So next slide, please. You know, failing, at least the right kind, is the trendy innovation thing right now. And my research totally supports that, but they rarely talk about how it feels and how to deal with those feelings. So good and bad news, my conclusion is that internationals can learn to listen if they practice failing on purpose. I use Sarah Ahmed's concept of the feminist killjoy to point out that it's not always going to feel good. In fact, it's very unlikely to feel good. But the good news is you can build capacity to deal with the feelings that come with killjoying. And I make recommendations of how to think around killjoy support practices. Next slide, please. So very briefly, you can think about it as bodies, narratives, and allies. Bodies, people are physical and social beings. So as a person, make sure you're sleeping, eating, exercises, and not identifying with your emotions. As an organization, encourage that balance and create psychological safety where anyone can come with any ideas or questions or criticism without worrying being punished. The organization can still use the narrative to direct attention toward their priorities by connecting the failures you're trying to the overall change you want to make. And finally, allies, think critical friends. You need supporters, but you also need them, people or organizations, to tell you when you're being crazy or incomprehensible because you're experimenting. You need that feedback. You don't know where you're going. No one does. And next slide. I just wanted to end with this image of building the bridge while crossing, because I think we get to learn to handle hanging in there. That's what I think the idea of killjoying or purposeful failure and killjoy support practices can do. And that's how emotions are relevant to internationals listening in peace-building partnerships. Last slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. I think this tells us a lot of new things, not only because your focus is on the internationals, the peace builders, but also on the way you focus on emotions and capacity to listen, etc. So maybe new fields for us all to think about, the capacity to listen and the capacity to fail, it seems like. So thanks a lot for that. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker. But first, maybe I should just say that I'd like to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function so that we can pick them up later on. And that goes for if you have questions to any of the panelists. Okay, so our third and final panelist today is Thomas Cole, who defended his dissertation with the title Possessed Earth, Ownership and Power in the Selwyn Peace Park of Southeast Myanmar, linking conservation issues and land issues strongly with peace, and emphasizing different notions and concepts of peace. He presented his dissertation at the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University in December 2020, so it's all new and fresh. Please, Thomas.
Hi there. Apologies, one of my colleagues just started speaking just as I was about to start talking here. So I just really appreciate being invited to this event. And I have to say before I begin, I don't have any background in peace and conflict studies. So for me, I always find it very interesting because, I mean, there's this talk of all of a sudden there being this problem of the local. I remember the first time I heard that there was this, what do they call it, the local turn in peace building. And it made me think, as an anthropologist, like, where were you before? How is this? Well, I mean, isn't it always been local? So, I mean, like, for me, it's an interesting to come from another perspective, because, I mean, for at least 100 years, anthropologists have been perfecting the art of trying to understand local practices. And, I mean, this idea of this invisibility cloak would be, from an anthropological perspective, how we have to be interested in an idea of methodological reflexivity, that we as a researcher are always involved in that research, so therefore we can't extract ourselves from it. And for me, this is along the lines of the same idea of some form of objectivity, this understanding that we can take an objective position between us and them. But anyway, that's just a sort of short digression. But anyway, so as you just heard, I very recently defended my thesis. And what's happened in the meantime? So I mean, usually when we begin these kind of presentations, we go like from the past. Released at the crack of dawn on the 1st of February this year, there was a column of troops and armed soldiers that came trundling into the sleepy capital of Naypyidaw. The soldiers then promptly rounded up and arrested the leaders of the reigning political party, the National League for Democracy, including the lady, or Aung San Suu Kyi, who had just won another landslide victory. This then heralded the return to a military rule. Now, when we were looking through the news reports, one of the most interesting pictures I have is this one you can see on this slide here. You can see from this picture, it sort of shows both the shock of this happening, but also the absurdity of it all. I mean, so you see this woman in this picture, she's doing her normal sort of daily morning workout routine that she then sends on Facebook to show her fans. And as she's doing this, you can see as this music is pumping and she's doing this very hard sort of exercise routine, these armored trucks are driving in columns behind her. And I'd also say it also points to a central incongruency in much of the reporting that we've seen in Myanmar. So, I mean, In the foreground, we can see there's this discourse of Myanmar's much lauded opening or transition that began in 2011. There's this idea of Myanmar transitioning from being a hermit authoritarianism state, as James C. Scott talks about it, or to this sort of modern, technologically advanced, liberal democracy. But all the time, we see in the background of this picture, there's this sort of underlying reality of this entrenched political and financial system that continues to be dominated by the military, and which they continue to act with relative impunity, as we've seen very recently. It also bears reminding that this is actually the third military coup since their independence. There was one in 1962 and another in 1988. I mean, this is still very few compared to the neighboring Thailand, that when I did a little count, I mean, in the same period of time, there was 6 in Thailand. But it still gestures towards this omnipresence of the military, of the military in Myanmar politics. Even under Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, through the 2008 constitution, they still continue to call the shots. We see this, there was also that they were fundamental to the faltering, and now I think we can largely say failed peace process. They've always been waiting in the wings in the background, so to speak. But this coup unleashed a massive rolling protests and civil disobedience movements that has swept the entire nation from north to south, east to west. And many people have then been demanding a return of these protesters, many of them, often at least. I mean, this is not all, but they'll be demanding this return of the National League to Democracy and some sort of return of normalcy. And these people's cries have been met with brutal crackdowns. I mean, watching these protests has been in turns incredibly inspiring, but also incredibly heart-wrenching. The latest count that I read on Tuesday was that there was 260 civilians that have been killed. I just read this morning that 2 more were killed last night. So this then begs this question of what is this return to normalcy? How would this happen how can we start grasping this? But then what I try and do in this thesis and what I want to do in this presentation is to sort of see what happens if we shift our gaze from the central Myanmar to see the story of this coup from the unruly borderlands. Next slide, please. Oh, my slide looks really messy in this. Oh, well, anyway. So we can have a look and see that the other story of the coup, this takes place in the background of a protracted armed conflict. I mean, there's been armed revolution in both the north of the country, the south of the country, the east and the west of what is now the capital of Naypyidaw. One of the longest running and what has been the focus for me for many years is in the southeast, with the conflicts that have been raging for around 70 years, just over 70 years. We can see the photo on the left here was when I attended something that's called Revolution Day in 2017. And by then they were already celebrating the 68th year of revolution against the central state. As many of you probably know, in 2012, there was a ceasefire signed called the National Ceasefire Agreement. In that, many of these armed revolutionary groups, like the group that I've been working together with, are called the Karen National Union. They signed a ceasefire, but what we find is that the jade-rich north and many of the armed groups there were completely left out of this, and conflict continued in these areas. But not only that, there was a continued militarization by the Myanmar army with low-scale conflicts in ceasefire areas. And this began to intensify in about 2017 as the Myanmar army started these projects of road building. They often call them sort of development projects, which then caused this sort of uptick in conflict. What we see then is that the months prior to the actual coup itself in northern Karen state in southeast Myanmar, there's some villages there that have been repeatedly shelled. This has led to about 6,000 people have been driven from their homes at the time of counting. I mean, as you see from the photo on the right here, This is from a report from one of the conflict areas done by the Korean Peace Network, who do some incredible work. And this is actually children doing the homework in a bunker or in trenches. And so this then leads me to ask that question. When we're talking about this return of normalcy, is this what kind of normality are we talking about? What is normalcy in this kind of conflict zone? Next slide, please. So what we see is, I have a map here, which is on the right. This is a map from the area where I did my fieldwork, which is in northern Korean state. It's called Mudra district. And you see that they are, I don't know how well you can see it here, but there's green stars, and each one of these green stars, there's 16 of them, are Myanmar. It is then started increasing exponentially. This particularly becomes evident when you see how between the years of 2018 and 2019, there was an increase of about 143% in armed attacks on civilians. So if releasing Aung San Suu Kyi and a return to normalcy of the pre-coup political landscape is not the answer, then the question becomes, what is? And one hint to these political alternatives can be found in the very same war-torn edges of Myanmar. So this is what was been the focus of my thesis, is something that's called the Salaween Peace Park. Next slide, please. So the Salaween Peace Park can be understood was basically, in its heart, it was an ensemble of indigenous people, activists, and armed groups who've been collaborating on transforming 5,500 square kilometers, so that's about the size of West Bank or 2 Luxembourgs, of highly contested terrain into what will be an indigenously run protected area that they're calling the Salaween Peace Park. What is happening here is that they are translating and rescaling indigenous practices and modes of dwelling into both government and conservation policy, which can be seen as a radically bottom-up project. Obviously, the area has been what WWF has described as a biodiversity hotspot. But what we see is that the plan is that it protects not only this hotspot, but also the lives and livelihoods of the people who co-inhabit this hotspot. It's rather than the sort of top-down, military-led project, this has local practices at the center where people are then left to continue to practice and to protect landscapes, and with local forms of sovereignty and local forms of federalism. At the same time, this park has the intention that it will also protect local indigenous people's right to self-determination. So I grasp this combining of both conservation and self-determination as what I call liberation conservation. You can see it as kind of like a means of revolution by other means. As in that sort of, you can see the Peace Park as a way of people continuing to strive for local autonomy, but at the same time also protecting the environment. We can also see this as a radical alternative to armed conflict, as it takes its point of departure in practices and the actual desires of the people that reside here themselves. And as we've seen, it effortlessly weaves together these deep histories of self-determination and efforts to protect biodiversity into the peace building. And as we see, it's been very highly effective. So last year, it first was awarded the, what's it called? God, I can't believe I've just lost the name of the word. The Equator Prize from the UN, and then later received the Goldman's Prize, Goldman's Environmental Prize, which some have called as sort of a Nobel Prize for nature. So it's attracting a huge amount.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. Next slide, please. I was going to talk about the build-up of my entire thesis, but I think we're going to have to jump over that and go to something that is something, next slide again, please. The most dreaded thing. I hate having to do this because it's something I find very uncomfortable, having to say some sort of recommendations. So I just want to sort of keep it and say, like, at least as I've tried to show throughout here, I don't think we can talk about there being a return to normality if this means that the flight of thousands of people and children doing homework in trenches. And so what I hope I show through my thesis and through this development briefer is that they are community-based initiatives like the Salomon Peace Park that might suggest ways we can chart a path forwards. I mean, one of the most important things I think needs to be pointed out is that they need an entire overhaul of the Constitution and of the raft of the liberal laws that were drafted by the Myanmar army and through colonial times, like the Communications Act, for example. And one possible avenue of action, if I'm going to have to say some sort of policy points, would have to be that, there's actually this talk of a return to this and maybe an intensifying of these long and highly successful practices that, for example, the Swedish government have been doing of supporting community-driven initiatives, working with these so-called non-state armed groups. Because as we see when we actually spend time in these areas, that these non-state armed groups or these rebel groups very often are treated as legitimate state authorities. They basically are de facto state actors. Not only this, but these local actors have unrivaled access and capacities that they've built over decades of serving these very communities, these affected communities, and have an overwhelming local legitimacy. This said, I mean, since 2011, much of this funding has been redirected. So especially after the peace process, much of this funding has been redirected towards central Myanmar, where it's more easily sort of disappeared into the coffers of generals and not easily reach these affected communities themselves. So, I mean, I guess my point here would be that with targeted sanctions, there also has to be some sort of targeted but also flexible aid that is both practical and direct. The one point that I think, so Sweden very recently, not recently, but a couple of years back now, ceased funding the refugee camps entirely. But we see these refugee camps are swelling and swelling again. And also there's organizations like Maytao Clinic, which is a border medical clinic, which has been chronically underfunded since this time, since 2011. And especially as you see, the Myanmar army is actually occupying hospitals. These are the kind of things that really need to return to this sort of cross-border aid. And I guess with that, I'm going to have to leave it at that. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all of those insights. And being a peace researcher by profession, I'd like to say that we all have so much to learn from a perspective of social anthropology. And I think also that you very eloquently showed how war and peace are not always binary, but violence continues to exist after peace agreements, and how do we actually deal with that conceptually. So thank you so much, all of you, for those highly super interesting presentations. I will now leave the floor and the word to Johanna Malm from Folke Bernadotte-akademin for your comments, and we will have 15 minutes for that, and after that we will have another 15 minutes left for Q's and A's. So please go ahead and write your questions or comments in that function. Johanna, please.
Thank you very much. At first, I would just like to congratulate all three of you for, finishing your PhDs and, coming to the end of that journey, which is an epic one, I think, for everyone. I actually counted. I was surprised to find that it was actually 6 years ago since I presented my own DDB at an EBA seminar. Having transitioned now into a practitioner role, I enjoyed very much reading your work and the critical reflections that we need as practitioners, because it's surprisingly how quick the brain transitions from the researcher to the practitioner, because there's so many things you have to do as a practitioner that, you know, there's not always time to think in that way. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I have, of course, questions and thoughts on your work. And I start just by Sanela's fascinating work on kvinna to kvinna and the experiences in the specific Bosnian case and as applied more broadly. I think the policy recommendations are most welcome. The kind of reminder to reflect over power dynamics actively, because I think, I mean, they will be there depending on the kind of theoretical approach one takes to power, of course. But if you take a more material approach, you know, these imbalances are there because of money is more on the one side than on the other from a political economy perspective. And I absolutely loved what you wrote on page 14 about the ideal Bosnian female, you know, peace builder, and the idea that you have discerned. I think we're all, this is not, of course, specific to kvinna. This is, I think, we all kind of look for that change agent as we imagine it. And you're right, finding individuals that match this romanticized image was not always an easy task. I think, and I don't read this as criticism of kvinna to kvinna. I think this is a case that applies much more broadly. I was thinking about your conception of power, because I find it a little bit undimensional. Is this really hierarchical sisterhood? If it is resisted by the Bosnian counterparts? And you also say that, you know, the power relations aren't always as straightforward, because you have information asymmetry, and it's always resistance. It isn't a binary. You know, and you mentioned that we should not get stuck in essentialist understandings of the local and the international. So I wondered, does this actually challenge your overarching argument of a hierarchical sisterhood? I was thinking about like variegated sisterhood or something else. I realize that this is your overall observation, but is that hierarchy really all that strict? So I wondered if you can reflect over that. You also discuss, you bring in the idea of self-colonization. And I was wondered, does it have to be that a person in the semi-periphery is the term that you use, if that person adopts preferences or ideas from the core, as it were, the term that you use, does it have to be self-colonization? Is that not paternalistic in tone? Can you reflect over that? Also, I wanted you discuss donor preferences. I'm thinking sometimes the idea of donor work is to actually influence policy and to do advocacy. How do you view that? Like from a normative point of view? Is a donor preference necessarily good or bad, or is it in what way? Because I sense that you think it's problematic, but I don't get. If you could unpack that would be excellent. Thank you. Moving on to Pernille's, I think it's groundbreaking in the sense that it focuses on the emotions of peace builders. I really enjoyed the connection that you make to Séverine Nolteser's work. Of course, she has a new book also coming, which discusses she discusses that the different roles of internationals and local forces. And I think it's interesting that you connect it to this, and also that you connect it to work regarding, the kind of emotional work that is required for privileged actors to be constructive partners in social change. So I think you really made an interesting link here in terms of the literature. I enjoy how you turn the gaze and stress that we as development partners need to make ourselves visible. But I was wondering if you could reflect more about the how in this. How is this going to be done? Is it reflecting over how donor agencies' weaknesses or our own internal politics? Is that what you suggest one should discuss actually with partners openly, more like friends? Or is it, you mentioned geopolitics, as part of this game. Is it an option to discuss the kind of, I think it's vague. I mean, it's not often you can see like the geopolitics connects with NGOs. It isn't all that direct, but you can discuss that vague link between geopolitics and as an NGO. Is that a way to bridge gaps or open up for emotions or remove the invisibility cloak? So if you could reflect more about how, and I'm also very curious to see how you imagine dealing with this when you now transit into actually a role at a donor agency. I also love your idea of the capacity contradiction, because you have to, on the one hand, donors have to find partners that are capable of, undertaking the work for behalf of the donor, but also they need to lack capacity in the way that they developed in a way. So it's a contradiction, I agree. But I wonder, isn't it a bit overgeneralization to say that internationals keep the focus on partners and capacities? Is that really what they do? I would be very curious to hear more about your thoughts about that capacity contradiction. So Thomas, I think this is an absolutely amazing piece of work. It's almost philosophical, spiritual in nature. I mean, reading the paper, I found this is my brain is very practically oriented. I mean, even as a researcher, I would focus on like dollars and roads and practical things. For me, this is like the spectral realm. It's like, ooh, I didn't know what part of my brain to use to comprehend it. I really appreciated the read. And I can sense how you have been deep into this during fieldwork. So I wanted to connect the idea of the spectral sovereignty into the practical, like in which way, if you could just tell us a bit more, is spectral sovereignty and the practices around that a good strategy to resist what you call ceasefire territorialization? Like, what is the link between the spiritual and the material in this sense? How is the spiritual or the spectral used to actually protect biodiversity and strive for greater autonomy in former war zones? This is the link that I would really appreciate hearing more about. I hear you. I mean, of course, giving policy recommendations is not always the researcher's favorite. But I think the ones that you provide in the paper are actionable. Support civil society, community-based, indigenously driven initiatives. But I was also wondering, I mean, in terms of the practical of Myanmar. But if you look at alternative forms of sovereignty and the thoughts you have around that. If you remove that from the Myanmar-specific context, how could the donor community or practitioners act based on that? What does that mean for donors and how we, as it were, relate to countries? The last thing was that I do sense a normative approach in your work, I guess, and you also reflect in the paper and in your presentation around positionality and the way that we as researchers get involved in our research. We become part of it. So I sense that you think this is a good approach. For conservation. Beyond just you have a theoretical claims, but there's also normative tone. If you could just comment briefly on what's your own journey in terms of thinking on these issues, and link to this. What does it mean to elevate ethnography theory? These were my brief reflections, and thank you all very much for thought-provoking reads and presentations.
Wow, thank you. Excellent questions and comments, and huge. I will let you all reflect on those issues, but not for too long, I'm afraid. So I think I can only give you like 2 minutes each, so that we have some time for the audience. So feel free to pick and choose what you think was most important that you want to reflect upon from Joanna's comments. And so Sanella, go ahead, you'll be first.
Oh, I have no idea where to start. I would need more time to. Great questions. Thank you for the insightful reading. Where to start? Hierarchical sisterhood, is it really well, I have obviously this question has been posed to me, and I reflected over it a lot. I mean, you could definitely, hierarchy could definitely be even more problematized. But studying this over time, I did take the decision to call this hierarchical sisterhood. I think that what I saw in the material, this concept kind of captured that. However, I mean, the only, hierarchies between the international and the local are not the only ones. I mean, you have Finna now and many other organizations that have local staff. And I think there are also new hierarchies there to be studied. However, I think that these relationships are much more dynamic. And of course, had I had more time, maybe I should have done more on this, but it's really important to understand. I've tried to show that there was resistance, that there was no total power, because I really also tried the tough position that Finna found itself in during this time. Many times, really lacking information and of course, when I looked at this over time. When you are in action and a practitioner on the ground, you can maybe see this. But when I had all the material, 20 years, I could see that this. Of course, this could be problematized even more. Can I take another question, or am I?
Really quick, if so. Or you can save it and we can come back afterwards if there are any Q&As, okay? Yeah. Thank you. Pernilla?
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. It's fantastic, of course, to have someone read and comment and make such insightful and interesting comments. So I'll try to speak really fast. But I think considering all your questions, like one key thing for me is the insight that you have to play two games at the same time. Or really you have to play the game today, right? You have to be a player that people recognize in the sphere you want to be in and make an influence. And at the same time, you're trying to change the rules for the game into something unknown, right? We're not fixing a car. We don't know what the end result will be. So I would say, so when you ask like how, what does it mean in practice? There are a few examples in the dissertation and in the brief, but I would say it's really up to everyone, depending on where you are, if you're working as a person, as a group, as an organization, or at another arena, to think, are we trying to change those rules still? Or are we too busy playing the game as it is? And I think, personally, at least so far, I think that is maybe one of the reasons why many practitioners have that nagging feeling of doubt. Now, you mentioned Severine Ottesera, who's interviewed hundreds and thousands of people in Peaceland, as she calls it, and people are crying, right? And like leaving the field and are crushed or becoming cynical and all these things. And I think just having a language for what are we doing and what are we trying to do, and to have a more grown-up discussion about the costs and benefits, right? And things that you can do, for example, at organizational level, which is going to be the most like first entry point for most practitioners, would maybe be to just ask, for the capacity building, for example. Well, I asked the question to my interviewees, what can you learn from local partners? And the responses were silence, or wow, lots of things. And then a quote I didn't put on the slide was like, wow, that was hard to answer because you just take it as a given, right? So try to think about all the different aspects, like when you're making a contract, when you are doing capacity building, like how can you reverse these hierarchies or reverse the business as usual or push the boundaries? I think I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There were many questions and hard to answer. I have only one Q&A after Thomas here, but I just like to address myself to Petra from Kvinna to Kvinna. It seems that you need to write your comment in the Q&A for me to read it, and yeah, that seems how it works. Just wanted to tell you that. Okay, so Thomas, please.
Set of tough questions. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to push them all together and answer them all at once, if I can try. I mean, so the first question you ask about is if I've got any practical sort of this spectral sovereignty in action. And so I don't actually talk about it that much in this development briefer, but in the last chapter of my thesis, I've got a chapter called Alter Politics, where I then talk about how these practices then return back to this village and how they were then playing out on the ground. And I use the term of alter politics in the way to show that when a lot of the times when we're talking about, in this case, sort of revolutionary politics, there's this tendency towards what the anthropologist Ghassan Haj talks about as counter politics. So this politics is just against something. We can call it anti-politics. So it's sort of like anti-colonialism, and it's always just pushing against. But what you see with these kind of the indigenous practices is this what has been described as an alter politics. Instead of just pushing against the established order, it's trying to create something new. So what you see in this, for example, these practices they're doing of this indigenous sovereignty is a form of indigenous sovereignty where they're actually showing an alternative way of organizing society, of organizing politics and economy. So it's instead of offering just a pushing away, it's trying to offer some sort of alternative. And as I try and show in this chapter, I show how they are actually combining these politics of counter-politics, of pushing against the state, with these alter politics, where they're actually sort of, for example, I show how a group of men then came to my house and they talked about how they wanted to protect this forest, and they tried everything to try and make this forest so people wouldn't go and poach there. And they tried going to the state, and it just simply hadn't worked. The state just didn't have that capacity in that area to protect this forest. So instead, they then went and they prayed to something called the Tida Dogaja, which is like this sort of the owner of all honesty, the owner of all nature. And then they told everyone in the village about this. And then everybody then worked out that they no longer could, no one then dared to go hunting in this part of this forest. So you see that through the spectral sovereignty, they actually achieved something that the local government had been trying to protect these areas through simply sort of putting soldiers in the forest, but they find that you can actually combine these two things at the same time. And then go into policy in that kind of way of like the wider perspective. I mean, this Salomon Peace Park in itself, many of these movements are part of a very large movement of indigenous sovereignty and of indigenous conservation, where groups across the world, for example, in Western Canada, for example, they're actually creating national parks that are again also built on local ideas of sovereignty. This is happening also in other parts of Asia. And this is sort of this growing movement of actually working from indigenous practices of protecting the land they live in, which they have done for hundreds of years. And then using these as sort of, again, an alternative. Instead of just pushing against local practicing, we've actually got something that we've been doing for years that works perfectly. Well, not perfectly. So yeah, and in the last question, I mean, I like this normative thing because, I mean, it's not something we talk about very much because, I mean, again, I can return to Ghassan Haj, this anthropologist. He likes to talk about politics as a little bit in this sort of Freudian framework of how we talk about desires and drives. It's something that everybody has them, but no one wants to show them or express them, so we repress them. And then they are then sort of subliminated in other certain places. So we're constantly subliminating. Everyone has a political position, but not everybody then. There's this constant sort of pressing down. I mean, So, I mean, everybody has a political position, and I am not entirely convinced that you could not have one. I don't believe there is this as Donna Haraway talks about this sort of position from nowhere, that you can somehow be completely disconnected and have every single piece of knowledge is situated knowledge, as she calls about it, as she describes it. So, I mean, when we talk about normative, I find it sort of, by normative we mean that do I have sort of political sympathies? Yes. And what I'm trying to do is at least be honest with them and sort of like say, okay, this is something I actually have followed and do have some sort of trust in. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I think what you said right now also speaks very well to Pernilla's talk before. And actually, I do think that all three of those pieces in your presentations are in themselves in a very nice conversation. I actually don't have any Q's and A's. Yes, I do now. I have one. Yeah, and I just got this now, so allow me to read it to you. It's from Petra Strader, who works at Kvinna till Kvinna, and she says like, the great space to listen in. My contribution is of course from a practitioner's perspective, and thanks it's to Sanella for the research and presentation on this relevant topic. Thanks also for accepting our invitations to come and discuss with us. Useful. It is very important to have a continuous talk about power and positions and to be sensitive to the women's rights organizations. We are aware of colonial history also as feminists. We practice analysis and dialogue, power and do no harm. We know the context and have received considerable good credit in evaluation or follow-ups. And I differ in two reflections. In some cases, we should stay home, and we do. And sometimes we don't enter, and we have to continuously make assessment where we can't listen, and then refrain to do harm. And that is what we use our tools for. And secondly, to use a word like supremacy, I'm less sure about. I think it brings our thoughts to really dark forces such as white supremacy that we rather not be associated with. Words are powerful too, and thinking how it is used. So I let you reflect on that, Sanella.
Yes, I think when I was at Kvinna till Kvinna that I actually said, it was a really great question that I answered, and white supremacy was absolutely not. Those two words together I have never used. I'm not even talking about ethnical supremacy, more ideological. And that's the answer that I gave Kvinna till Kvinna. And I try to emphasize that, of course, every time I have the opportunity to talk about my work. So, yeah.
Thank you for commenting. I also think that you do capture a discussion which has been held for a long time between different feminisms and different feminist organizations, which indicate that we are not all in the same boat as women, because we differ. And I do think that the concept of hierarchies of sisterhood, I think, is really interesting. Actually, I don't have any questions in the, well, maybe I do now.
I also have a comment or a question on something that Pernilla said, but of course you can. Yeah.
Let's see here if no, I don't have any more Q's and A's here, and we are running out of time, so I'd like to give you the opportunity, the three of you, if you have a last kind of takeaway or so from this, or Johanna, if you have a last reflection. No, okay. So then I'd like to, I really like to thank all of you, all four of you, Sanela and Pernilla and Thomas, for excellent dissertation briefs. And I think that Pernilla's and Thomas are out there at the EBA's webpage, so they are there to you to look for. And Sanela's will be published in a short while. I am myself really like interested and intrigued in this issue, this whole discussion between the like international and local approaches to peace building. So I have learned so much from listening to you, and also from Johanna's excellent comments and reflections. So my head is kind of filled with ideas to take away from here, and it also indicates to me the need for us to at EBA to dig further into this issue, and to I mean, it's a never-ending complex web, like spider web of intricate relations between the local and the international. So thank you really so much, and thank you also to all of you who listened. And I hope to see you again at the new EBA seminars. You can follow our webpage and sign up for newsletters, and you can also be updated about coming events, seminars, and other events that we do. And also we have a podcast where we talk about issues, all kinds of issues related to development cooperation, not only peace building, but a number of different issues and aspects. And with that, thank you so much for this afternoon, and have a good rest of the day, all of you, and a good weekend and Easter, and yeah, thank you. Bye bye.